Hello everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. I have lived the reading year of 2024 to the full before making this video. On New Year's Day, I finished reading Mistress of the Empire, the final book in the Empire Trilogy. I really wanted to include this book in my reading stats for the year that, by now, is history. As mentioned earlier, this has been a very good reading year for me. Let's dive into some numbers. I read a total of 62 books with a total page count of 26,587. In 2023, I read less books, 57 in total, but my page count was higher with 37,252 pages. When I focus on the fantasy genre alone, I read 41 books in 2024 with a total page count of 21,229. This makes the average fantasy book 518 pages thick. The year before, I read 47 fantasy books, which amounted to 24,375 pages. The average book then also counted 518 pages. I guess that's about the average length of a fantasy book. Even though I read less than I did in 2023, I still feel very good about this past reading year. In this video, I will be ranking all of the 41 fantasy books I read in 2024. I will go through them in the chronological order in which I read them. For most of the books in this overview, I made a separate video of my reading experience. If you want to hear more details about my thoughts on a book or a series, check those out in the description down below. After my disappointment of the first Discworld I read, Guards, back in May of 2023, it took some time before I had enough courage to turn back to this series. The We Free Men is the first book in the Tiffany Aching sequence, and it is Discworld novel number 30. This was my first read in 2024, and I was relieved to find that I liked it very much. The Knack McFeagle are hilariously funny, which in a way saved Discworld for me. I gave it 78 points, which compares to 4 stars. I then read The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, about which I'd heard many good things. I liked it, but it certainly did not live up to its promise. Too fairy tale-like for my taste. Perhaps it's simply too old, and I believe I should have read it when I was younger. It scored a meager 64 points out of 100, a 3-star in the higher regions. Inspired by the We Free Men, I then picked up the second book in the Tiffany Aching sequence by Terry Pratchett, A Hatful of Sky. Really enjoyed it, but not as much as the first book in this subseries. 71 points. Alongside the 3 books I've mentioned, I also read the final book in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, Assassin's Quest. This was my first absolutely great read of the year. In my separate video about this trilogy, I go into depth about what I liked about it. Strangely enough, I didn't get around to reading more of Hobb in 2024. Something I will remedy most certainly in this new year. Assassin's Quest scored 93 points, very close to 5 stars. 2024 was the year I finished reading my very first huge fantasy series, The Wheel of Time. In my first fantasy year, I read the prequel and the first 11 books, so I had the final 3 books left to read, which were largely written by Brandon Sanderson. The Gathering Storm was my return to this amazing series after a break of 2.5 months. I loved it. After a couple of lesser titles, the story really picks up again. With 95 points out of 100, it is just 1 point shy of a true 5-star read. It was simply great to be back in this world, and Sanderson has done an excellent job. Then I started with the Chronicles of Pern by McCaffrey. The first book, Dragonflight, took some time to getting used to. The author dumps the reader into this strange world without much explanation or setup. But once I understood what certain things meant and what the story actually was about, I was all in. The writing is not very memorable, but the story and the world building more than make up for that. 85 points out of 100, the highest score in the 4-star range, which puts it just above the Wee Free Man. Convinced now that I wanted to read the entire Discworld, I set out to reading this huge series in their publication order, starting with The Color of Magic. Great title, but I was warned by many booktubers that this may not be the best book to get invested into Discworld. And they're right. A very confusing, strangely told story that didn't really resonate with me on any level. I was glad that Nev from Nev's Book Channel had recommended I read Dragonflight by McCaffrey first. This way, I really enjoyed one of the chapters in The Color of Magic, which is a satirical retelling of the Dragon Book. Otherwise, this book would have scored even lower than the 62 points I gave it. Then I finished listening to Duncton Quest, the second book in the Duncton Chronicles trilogy by William Horwood. I'd been listening to this book for 3 months, but I enjoyed everything about it. This confirmed my memory of how great these books were to me when I first read them long ago. I did a separate video on Duncton Quest, so if you want to hear more about my reading experience, or listening experience in this case, check that one out. This book scored 98 points out of 100, a very solid 5 stars. My first truly amazing read for this year, even though it was an audio experience. At this point, my reading year has advanced halfway through February. I read Towers of Midnight, book number 13 in the Wheel of Time. Even though I had some troubles because of the fact that my book was a misprint and I had to get hold of another copy, I thoroughly enjoyed it. There is an overdose on war and battles, which is even worse in the final book, but apart from that, it was exhilarating to go towards the conclusion of this series. 94 points out of 100, which puts it just below The Gathering Storm. Then I immersed myself into the world of the Dragonriders of Pern. After the first book, I read Dragon Quest. This time around, the world of Pern and the quest of its Dragon Riders was familiar, but this time the story was less gripping to me. Not a bad book at all, with some very impressive moments, but overall just slightly less than the first book, Dragonflight. I gave Dragon Quest 84 points out of 100, 1 point less than book 1. I then continued with the so-called Harper Trilogy. In the video I made about the first 2 trilogies in this series, I explain why I chose this reading order. The first book in the YA trilogy, Dragon Song, was the best of all 6 books for me. Such a lovely coming-of-age story with lots of beautiful scenes within this intriguing world. I read it in one day and immediately binged the remaining 3 books in these 2 trilogies. 92 points out of 100, which puts it right behind Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. The other 2 books in the Harper Hall trilogy, Dragon Singer and Dragon Drums, were not as good as the first one. Real YA with Enid Blyton vibes. Still very enjoyable reads, but McCaffrey doesn't maintain the magical feel in Dragon Song. Dragon Singer scored 79 and Dragon Drums 77 points out of 100. Still decent 4 stars. The final book in the first trilogy, White Dragon, was, again, the least in the series. I find it such a pity when the books in a series show a downward trend. It should be just the other way around, that the final book is the ultimate bang in the story. All books in both trilogies are good, and I will most certainly be reading more in the Dragonriders of Pern series, but this final book didn't fully deliver in my opinion. I gave it 82 points, which puts it in between Dragon Quest and Dragon Singer. Then finally I got around to reading Janny Wurts for the first time. Because of all the praise on Booktube, I'm quite confident I will like this author. Therefore, I decided to read all of her works in their order of publication. Like with Terry Pratchett and Guy Gavriel Kay, this gives me the opportunity to observe these writers in their development. So I started with Sorcerer's Legacy, Janny Wurts' debut novel, which was published in 1982. Some authors write their best work at the beginning of their publishing career, and some really grow along the way. Janny Wurts definitely belongs to the latter. Her debut is not a bad book at all, but it isn't very good either, for several reasons. It foreshadows greatness to come in her later books. I gave Sorcerer's Legacy 75 points out of 100, almost 4 stars. Back to Terry Pratchett and Tiffany Aching with Wintersmith. I liked it more than A Hatful of Sky, but it didn't beat The We Free Men. With only 1 more point than the Janny Wurts debut, it ranks just above that book. We have arrived in April of 2024, and I am doing a buddy read with BJ Minton, one of the best friends of this channel. We decided on The Lies of Locke Lamora, the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch. BJ was not a fan, to put it mildly, but I was. Great writing, fun banter between the characters, and really entertaining heists in a pretty cruel world. With 91 points out of 100, it ranks just below Dragonsong. Going back to Brandon Sanderson's Cosme with Warbreaker. After Mistborn Era 1, Elantris and the Emperor's Soul, it had been longer than half a year. Warbreaker is such an easy and fun read with, as can be expected from Sanderson, a wonderful magic system. It scored the same high 93 points as Assassin's Quest, so it should be ranked in the same spot. Still, when forced to choose between the two, I think the Robin Hobb book is just slightly more solid. Perhaps because it's part of a series. But, if I'm not mistaken, a sequel to Warbreaker is planned to be written at some point. For now, it ranks below Assassin's Quest, but just a great, great book. Then I finally picked up Piranesi, the shorter novel by Susanna Clarke. I had heard so many booktubers rave about this book, so I wanted to see for myself what the hype was all about. Many times high praise can result in disappointment, but here the opposite happened. I was overwhelmed by this small book, and even now it's vividly present in my memory. Such an intriguing and superbly told story with a high level of surrealism. Extremely minor flaws prevented me from giving it a 100 out of 100 score. But with 98 points, it ranks at the top of this list. Duncton Quest also scored 98 points, but this was a reread, and if pressured, I would choose Piranesi over Duncton Quest. In several videos, I mentioned that this book was and remained a serious contender for my Book of the Year. We'll see how that works out at the end of this video. In May, I got to read the final book in the Wheel of Time, A Memory of Light. In January of 2023, I had started reading this epic series with the prequel, New Spring, and now I would read its finale. Like most books in this series, A Memory of Light is a great book, but being the apotheosis of 15 books in total, I had expected more. More grandeur, more revealing plot twists, more satisfaction. Again, a great book which I thoroughly enjoyed, but still, it left me slightly disappointed after its final page. The Wheel of Time will always be one of my most dear fantasy series. Nothing can change that. This closing volume got 93 points out of 100, on par with Assassin's Quest and Warbreaker. Because of the immense scope of the series, it deserves the top spot of these three. In between the huge battle in the Wheel of Time, I tried to read The Light Fantastic by Terry Pratchett, book number 2 in the Discworld. This was a huge step up after The Color of Magic. I finally could discern a story, and in particular the character of Cohen the Barbarian made me laugh out loud many times. Still, the way Pratchett composes his stories is more confusing to me than that it is enlightening. Also, the absurdity of the story at times makes me wonder why I have to read it. Enjoyable, and with 74 points, close to 4 stars, but up until this point, I wouldn't call myself a true Discworld fan, as of yet. Again, together with B.J. Minton, I embarked on my Red Rising journey. And again, B.J. was lukewarm on the first book. I liked it. Not as much as I'd like Locke Lamora's adventures, but it certainly inspired me to read the second and third book right away. The month of June was Red Rising time. There were some problems, which made this a trilogy with 2 faces for me. I talk about this in my separate video. The first book scored 82 points, which puts it right behind Dragon Quest by Anne McCaffrey. The second and third book, Golden Sun and Morning Star, each scored 84 points. Even though I really enjoyed reading these books, I wasn't convinced if I would continue with the series. The harsh violence and the overdose on battle scenes made me doubt. But now that time has moved on, I really feel like continuing. There is also much fun to be had reading these books. At the end of June, it was time to start with the first trilogy written by Guy Gavriel Kay, the Fiona Farr Tapestry. Even though these are not very long books, they took some time to consume. The Summer Tree, book number 1 in the series, with 400 pages, took me 10 days. Even though it is extremely well written, and the world building and story and character work all are superbly done, the pick-up ability of the book was relatively low. The younger Guy Gavriel Kay tended to lose himself in details of the background of his world, which at times got in the way of the story. Still, high-quality fantasy, which has created everlasting memories inside of me. The Summer Tree scored 89 points out of 100, a 4.5 stars. This puts it right after Locke Lamora. Book number 2, The Wandering Fire, with 352 pages, took me only 7 days, and it scored 92 points, just behind Warbreaker. My experience with the third book, The Dark Road, no doubt was influenced by my simultaneous read of The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. These 2 books differ greatly in pick-up ability, where I would always pick up Sanderson without thinking, and I really had to nudge myself to continue with Kay. Because of this, I spent 28 days with this book of 426 pages. Even though The Darkest Road contains the most beautiful pages of prose I've ever come across in fantasy, I rated it no higher than 90 points, still a high score. Perhaps I sound a little bit disappointed, but this was an absolutely great book, despite that I will probably never reread this trilogy. Before going into my Stormlight Archive adventure, let me first put a couple of other books in their rightful place here. First, my hugely disappointing read of Equal Rights by Terry Pratchett. Hardly any story, hardly any fun, hardly anything worthwhile, really. 44 points for the effort. My longest audio experience is Duncton Fount by William Horwood. It took me roughly 7 months to listen to the 980 pages, and even though I enjoyed it very much, it didn't live up to my exalted memory of this book. Listening to it, I found it needlessly long and even a bit boring at times. Also, the scenes that made me cry back in the day didn't really touch me that strongly anymore. Still, with 90 points out of 100, an excellent experience, of course. Then it was time for Stormlight Archive. In August, I concocted the plan to read 1 book in this series each month, so that I would be completely up to date when Book 5, Wind and Truth, would be published at the beginning of December. The Way of Kings kept me busy for 16 days and completely lived up to its reputation. Such a great book, where the author takes his time to make the reader at home in this Roshar world and the many, many characters. Also, the depth of the story truly drew me in and made me want to keep on reading. The many pieces of the puzzle kept me curious and hungry for more. Nothing but praise, and with 97 points out of 100, it is one of the few 5 stars in this year. If I had to say something about the 3 points it didn't get, it would only be the length of the book. This is demanding and feeds on the danger of losing interest. Other than that, chapeau. All of the above goes for Words of Radiance as well. In between the 2 books, I took a small Stormlight break for about 4 weeks. So a little behind my reading schedule, I again spent 16 days with this huge book. It is 1,310 pages in my edition. Perhaps it would have been better if I had taken another break of 4 weeks after this second book, but within 2 weeks I started reading Oathbringer. Regarding all the elements of its content, this book is right on par with the other 2 as far as I'm concerned. The length of this book was its only real downside this time. Even more than 50,000 words longer than Words of Radiance, Oathbringer with a tiny font size and more than 1,300 pages truly daunted me. I was as invested in the story, the world, the characters and everything, but the slow pace forward through the many pages got in the way. All 3 books score 97 points, but very minute differences and the slog feel of Oathbringer puts them in this order. I finished reading the 3rd book on November 18, which would have left me with about 18 days to read Rhythm of War before the release of Wind and Truth. After my experience with Oathbringer, it didn't seem right to push myself. Reading has to be fun, and the Stormlight Archive is such an enormous endeavor by Sanderson that I really want to savor every page. Even with the rather disappointed reviews of Wind and Truth I've seen so far, I still want to take my time to make sure I don't rush things. The mass paperback of Rhythm of War and the hardcover of Wind and Truth are waiting patiently for me behind me to continue with this series. Am I a Stormlight Archive fan? You bet I am. There is much to be said in favor of shorter books, but this is how the author has chosen to tell his story. So far, it has been an unforgettable experience. In between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer, I read the story Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell, which I liked very much. Within the 61 pages in my Arcanum Unbounded edition, an entire world unfolds, which holds great promise. I truly hope Sanderson will return to this world, because this story has made me very curious. I gave it 86 points out of 100, which is a very high score for me, because shorter stories usually leave me unfulfilled. Not in this case. This puts it at the bottom of the great tier. Edgedancer, which I also read in the Arcanum Unbounded collection, wasn't as good to me. I really looked forward to reading more about Lift, one of my favorite characters from the Stormlight Archive, but the story meanders a little bit to nowhere in particular for a long time. In his postscript after the novella, Sanderson writes that he initially intended it to be about 18,000 words. It ended up being 40,000 words. Ah well, that just happens sometimes, particularly when you are me. I believe the power of the story would have benefited with less words. In Sanderson's mind, less is more apparently doesn't apply. Edgedancer, nonetheless, is very nice, and with 79 points, it's a very decent 4 stars still. The same rating as Dragon Singer, but I liked Edgedancer just a teeny bit more. Halfway October, it was time for another Pratchett. Mort, number 4 in the series, was a great relief, just as The Wee Free Men had been at the beginning of this year. After Equal Rights, I feared another disappointment. But this very nice story, which is told also in an understandable way for a change, pleasantly surprised me. I believe that the Death books will become my favorite. The start is very promising in any case. I gave Maud 84 points, which is the same as the 2 final books in the first Red Rising trilogy. Let's put Maud in between those. I believe I've read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings at least 3 times altogether. Because of its cult status, I wanted to return to Middle-earth, and convinced after many raving reviews about Andy Serkis's narrating skills, I listened to his version of The Hobbit. Such a lovely book, which hasn't lost any of its magic. Nostalgia peaked, and indeed the Serkis narration is great. The movies have taken over the story of the book for me, so it was very good to return to the source of Tolkien's word. I gave the audio version of The Hobbit 87 points, so it belongs in the great tier. In my search for the origins of the modern fantasy genre, I read The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Duncton. This was a buddy read with Nev from Nev's Book Channel, and we did a live stream together about this book, and Fantastis by George MacDonald, another great-great-grandfather of the genre. This last one I DNF'd, by the way. Nev and myself had pretty similar thoughts about this book, which was first published in 1924. Fantastis really was unreadable for me, but this book by Lord Duncton, whose real name was Edward Plunkett, was actually quite nice. The prose had some extremely beautiful moments, but on the other hand it was also very clunky and juvenile at times. The story was nice, although the author indulges in several asides and switches side characters for main characters and vice versa. But at the end it was an enjoyable encounter with pre-Tolkien fantasy. It scored 71 points out of 100. The same as Pratchett's A Hatful of Sky. Let's put it right behind the light fantastic. There are 4 books left, and up until now, my book of the year has been left untouched. Keeping one of the promises to myself, I finally picked up the Empire Trilogy by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. I very much enjoyed Feist's Rift War saga, which I read in 2023. That trilogy is set mainly in the world of Midkemia, which is somehow connected through a mysterious rift with another world called Kellerwan. The Empire Trilogy is set in this world, where society upholds a unique view on honor. Both trilogies take place in the same time period, and at certain points the stories interconnect, which is very well done and great fun to read. I will be making a separate video on the Empire Trilogy very soon. It's always a surprise to me whether I will continue a trilogy right away after its first book or not. In this case, there was no question about it. After Daughter of the Empire, which has a very satisfactory ending, I simply needed to know how things for Mara of the Akoma would progress. So I read all 3 books, more than 2,200 pages in total, back to back. Before I will show you how I rated these 3 books, let's get this one short read left on my list out of the way. On December 31, I read The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I'd been hearing very positive things about this children's book from before the Second World War, and a short read is always welcome in between all the big books I read. It is very short, so I read it in one sitting. No, this wasn't for me, I'm afraid. I guess I'm not suited for symbolism without a real story. Sure, the book has tender moments and I can appreciate the writing style, but it is so focused on everything between the lines that the lines themselves hardly entertain anymore. Like with almost all books, I am glad to have read it. I now am initiated in The Little Prince, but had it been a bigger book, this may have become a DNF. 54 points, which compares to 2.5 stars, my almost least favorite book of the year. Back to the Empire. I absolutely love this series. It is so well written and its pickup ability is very high. you really want to continue. The authors don't leave their readers hanging in unexplained world building, but everything is perfectly dosed presented, and the political intrigue is superb. Almost inevitably there are assassinations, battles, and ruthless violence, but these are not unnecessarily spun out. Also, they support the story. In my upcoming video I will go into more detail, but for now let me show you where these 3 books rank. All 3 books score 4.5 stars, but there are differences. The first book, Daughter of the Empire, scored 89 points out of 100, which puts it between Duncton Found and The Summer Tree. Good company, I'd say. The second book, Servant of the Empire, was equally good, although it dragged a little bit in the middle. Therefore, 1 point less, 88, just above The Hobbit. The final book, Mistress of the Empire, truly delivered. All the threads woven in the previous pages come together into this ultimate finale. Very skillfully done and highly entertaining. Also, what I like most, the book, like the other 2, is filled with wisdom. With 93 points out of 100, it is on par with A Memory of Light, Assassin's Quest, and Warbreaker. This one is difficult, but in the end, I'll put it just below Warbreaker. Great books that I can easily recommend to anyone. As you may have noticed, there are still no changes at the top, which means that my book of the year of 2024 is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Ever since reading this small jewel, it was set on this course. Nothing topped this surrealistic mystery, which is expertly written. I will definitely be reading Clarke's other huge book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I only don't know yet when that will be. I hope that I will have just as great fun in this coming reading year of 2025 as I had in its predecessor. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.